Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this edition of 30 on Thursdays, SusQtech's bi-weekly webinar series about anything and everything having to do with SharePoint. Jump into a couple of logistical things here before we get started with today's presentation. If this is your first time on a 30 on Thursday, I can tell you a little bit about it. It is a bi-weekly 30-minute webinar series. We try to keep it short, limited to 30 minutes. We would cover a range of topics having to do with SharePoint, whether it be SharePoint 2010, SharePoint 2013, or what have you. Our next one is coming up 2 weeks from today on March 21st. We're still nailing down the topic for that, but we'll send out an email after that once we get that nailed down. The entire schedule is available at susqtech.com/webinars. Today's session is being recorded, so if you have to duck out early, you can go to our site in the next 24 hours and it'll be available. Plus all of our previous 30 on Thursdays, or a large majority of them, are available at susqtech.com/archive-webinars. And as Danny goes through our presentation today, if you have any questions, please use the window to the right. We will save all the questions at the end, just allow Danny to get through the material, and we'll handle them at the end. So in addition to 30 on Thursdays, we do a lot of other online training activities here at SusQtech. Our next paid 3-hour course is coming up with SharePoint MVP Mark Anderson. He's going to be talking about using jQuery in SharePoint 2010. That's coming up on March 28th. You can get more details on our website. And very similar to 30 on Thursdays, all of our previous formalized training webinars are available as recordings for paid download. We have like 7 or 8 of them out there now. I think it's showing 6 here, covering all topics from search to InfoPath to responsive design to authentication, authorization, that type of thing. So you can get those on our website as well. So without further ado, we'll jump into today's topic, which is SharePoint 2013 in the app model. Our presenter is Danny Jessee. He's a solution architect here at SusQtech. I'm Steve Witt. I will be your moderator, and if you need anything, please feel free to use the chat window or the question window and go to webinar. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and give Danny control. All right. You got it, Danny?
Got it. Thank you, Steve. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Steve mentioned, I am Danny Jessee, Solutions Architect at SusQtech. And today we're going to be talking about the SharePoint 2013 app model. And we're going to focus on this from a developer perspective. Just a quick rundown of the agenda we're going to cover today. We're going to start by kind of surveying the landscape of what your development options were prior to SharePoint 2013. We're going to talk about some of the shortcomings of those approaches. And then some of the steps that 2013 has taken to improve the developer experience. And finally, of course, the subject of the day is apps for SharePoint, so we will end with a discussion and hopefully a demo of those as well. So for those of you who have had the privilege of working with SharePoint since at least the 2007 release, that's where we're going to start our survey today. Certainly you're all familiar with farm solutions. So the WSP extension, the CAD file format. Obviously, that's full server-side object model code. No limitations, for better or worse, in functionality or scope in terms of what you can do. Some of the shortcomings here, of course, any deployment of a WSP required physical access to the server. And for developers who were new to the platform, it was very easy to, for better or worse, deploy some potentially harmful solutions to the server farm. So I make a couple notes here. Certainly every developer has cut his teeth on running with elevated privileges at some point. And we've all learned the rules of disposing objects. And if we haven't, then maybe at some point in our careers we set up a nightly task to run an IIS reset on the SharePoint front end. Of course, that's not a good idea. So moving forward to SharePoint 2010, how did we improve upon that experience? Well, SharePoint 2010 introduced sandbox solutions. And obviously that was with an eye toward the cloud, with SharePoint 2010 being the first release of the platform that was geared more toward cloud and hosted deployments. Sandbox solutions obviously address some of the shortcomings of farm-level solutions by giving basically site collection administrators the ability to deploy these solutions without requiring physical access to the server. And also in the name of security, sandbox solutions ran in their own processes. So had a restricted, limited, safer, quote-unquote, subset of the SharePoint object model that it could access. And those assemblies were loaded in a different process, so outside of the IIS worker process where full trust code would run. So what's wrong with this picture? Well, a number of things. So whether we're talking about farm solutions or sandbox solutions, we still have code that's executing on the SharePoint front-end servers. And to be quite honest, it's difficult to run code anywhere but the front-end servers when we're dealing with SharePoint. For anyone who's worked with the ASMX web services and prior versions of SharePoint, not the best experience. And certainly, we've all had our fair share of difficulties going through MSDN documentation, for instance, trying to determine exactly how I need to structure an XML payload to send to one of those web service method calls. And SharePoint 2010 also introduced the client object model, the CSOM, but it wasn't fully there yet. Now, another problem, SharePoint developers were required for everything. So you needed someone with a skill set that included Visual Studio, .NET, and the SharePoint server-side object model. Now, that said, there were some steps in the right direction, particularly with SharePoint 2010. So the introduction of the client-side object model gave clients the ability to use Manage.NET or Silverlight to access the SharePoint server without necessarily having to run code on the SharePoint front end itself, as well as a browser-based JavaScript class library. But again, these were very limited in scope and capability. Through listdata.svc, SharePoint 2010 also introduced the ability to access list and library data through a REST-based interface. So all of these sorts of things allow for interaction with SharePoint without requiring that footprint directly on the SharePoint front ends themselves. Unfortunately, with 2010, these were still limited compared to what your options were using the full server-side object model. So let's talk a little bit about what our options are now in SharePoint 2013. I like to refer to this as the slide, the report back to the boss slide in terms of what the ground truth is with SharePoint 2013. So depending on what you've heard, in SharePoint 2013, farm-level solutions are still fully supported. So in fact, they're the only way to deploy administrative extensions to the platform. So if you're dealing with timer jobs or custom PowerShell commandlets, you're still obviously running a farm-level solution to do that. The sandbox solutions that were introduced in SharePoint 2010 are still allowed and still supported, but they have been deprecated, as have the ASMX web services and RPC using OWS SDR.dll. So obviously the direction in which Microsoft is trying to point everyone with 2013 is apps for SharePoint, which is the subject of our discussion for today. Now before we get into apps in greater detail, we talked a little bit about how SharePoint 2010 introduced the client object model. That's been greatly enhanced in SharePoint 2013. Many new APIs have been added for search and taxonomy, manage metadata, user profiles, and workflow. And it's really now possible to have that full, rich interaction with SharePoint from external platforms that may not have been possible or may have been very limited prior to SharePoint 2013. I also mentioned the underscore VTI underscore bin client.svc has been aliased to underscore API. So you'll now see a lot of references to underscore API. And that's basically the REST-based interface to that client object model entry point. So much easier for JavaScript and any other non.NET client to leverage the capabilities of CSOM. So which API do I want to use? Well, as you see, there are plenty of options. And depending on what exactly you're trying to do, there could be one or more APIs that are right for the job. So I tried putting this in tabular format, but this graphic from MSDN pretty much sums it up the best. And of course, our focus today is apps for SharePoint. So as you can see, there's some overlap in how we can, which APIs we can use to build apps for SharePoint. We have the JavaScript APIs, we have the Silverlight Client Object Model APIs, and the REST and OData endpoints. So when we talk about apps for SharePoint, it's a new mechanism to deploy code-based customizations to the platform. Much like a WSP file is a CAB, an app file has a .app extension, which is actually a zip file that's packaged using the same format as the Office OpenXML files, using that open package convention format. Apps are good for self-contained and isolated pieces of functionality. So anything in terms of adding basic files, CSS files, JavaScript files, to the SharePoint content database, as well as creating pages and lists in isolated storage that's known as the app web. We're going to get a little more into app web as we move through this presentation. But the bottom line with apps for SharePoint is that no server-side code is running inside of SharePoint. And that's a big improvement. So we say apps everywhere. So for those of you who've had the privilege of working with 2013, you now know that just about everything you can think of is an app for SharePoint. So when we go to that site actions gear, and we'll hopefully get into this with our demo later on, we choose add an app, you see that I'm not only adding things that you might typically consider apps for SharePoint, but when I want to add a document library or a custom list or task list or announcement list, those are all apps as well. Now, what are your development options for apps for SharePoint? Well, if you're working in the cloud, you have the ability to use the Napa Office 365 development tools, which gives you a very rich browser-based development environment experience. You don't need Visual Studio. You don't need any other tools. Purely a browser-based experience to develop and deploy your apps for SharePoint in O365. You do have the ability to take those app projects and download them and open them in Visual Studio if you need to extend those capabilities at all. But what we're going to focus on here today is an on-prem deployment, and we're going to use the Office Developer Tools for Visual Studio 2012. So when we talk about the different types of apps for SharePoint, depending on who you ask, there are either 2 or 3 different types of apps. If it's 2 types, you're dealing with SharePoint-hosted or cloud-hosted apps. If there are 3 types, we further break down the cloud-hosted apps into 2 distinct categories, provider-hosted and auto-hosted. So when we talk about a provider-hosted app, those can run in the cloud, or they can run in any other on-prem web server that isn't the SharePoint front end. And that could even be an Apache server or some other non.NET or non-IIS platform. When we're dealing with an auto-hosted app, that's going to have some special plumbing in it that's going to automatically provision any needed resources for my app to Windows Azure and SQL Azure, really giving you limitless flexibility and scalability. But today here in our demo, we're going to focus on SharePoint-hosted apps, which are on-prem and use 100% client-side code. And when we deal with SharePoint-hosted apps, we're going to deal with 2 concepts, a host web and an app web. The host web is going to be the SP web where the app is actually installed. The app web is going to be a special web where the app is going to provision any resources that it needs local to that instantiation, to that deployment of the app. So here's that same information in more of a graphical format, again indicating the cloud-hosted app and the SharePoint-hosted app, and then breaking the cloud-hosted apps down further into provider-hosted and auto-hosted. But you see in the case of a SharePoint-hosted app, we have that app web that's optional with the cloud-hosted apps. So what sorts of things can you do in an app for SharePoint? Well, just about everything you can think of. And there are some caveats with a number of these things. So when we're talking about being able to do workflows in apps for SharePoint, those tend to be very limited in scope and in capability, and they tend to be focused on workflows that run within the app web and not the host web. But for things like custom CSS or JavaScript files, custom actions, anything that's declarative in nature and doesn't require any server-side code, those are very logical and natural fits for apps for SharePoint. There's even the ability to do remote event receivers, and that's actually leveraging a WCF service, again, hosted outside of SharePoint, but that can remotely respond to events that take place within SharePoint, much like the event receivers that you may be familiar with deploying in sandbox or farm-level solutions today. So we talked about the different types of apps. Apps can also come in a number of shapes as well. And when we talk about app shapes, we're talking about, in the case of an immersive full-page app, it's exactly as the name suggests. Much like a layouts page or an application page in a prior version of SharePoint, it's good for a scenario-based app. When it needs to be the focus and it's consuming the full page, you can still use the SharePoint Chroming to maintain the look and feel, but that full-page app does not need to be hosted inside of SharePoint. When we talk about part apps, obviously most of us are familiar with web parts. One difference with a part app in SharePoint 2013 is that it's actually just content that's surfaced through an iframe. So once again, that content, that business logic, that application that's being surfaced through the app part doesn't need to reside within SharePoint. And there's some special capabilities built into the controls to make that a seamless experience in terms of not having scroll bars or other things that you might typically expect with an iframe. And when we're talking about extension apps, that's anything that's adding custom actions. So a custom ribbon button, an edit control block action, those are all things that you would do in an extension app, declaratively through XML, much like you would have done in a prior release of SharePoint as well. So we talked about app webs and host webs. So just to talk a little bit more about the concept of an app web, each installation of an app gets its own unique URL, and it's provisioned at the time that the app is installed. So there's some unique identifiers that are built into the URL of each app web, and it's based on this convention with a prefix and a hash that are defined administratively through PowerShell and through central admin, the app domain, and then the relative site URL / the app name. So the SharePoint takes advantage of some of the browser's built-in cross-site scripting protection, and it's recommended that you provision your app domain separately from your host domain. So if your host domain, if SharePoint's web application is intranet.mycompany.com, the app domain should be something configured such as mycompanyapps.com. So again, a completely separate physical top-level domain. So depicted graphically, the differences between a host web and an app web. You see that app web is an isolated subsite that is unique to that installation of the app, where it can deploy its own lists, workflows, any custom assets that it may need. And then the host web also has the ability to reach out across the network, across into the cloud to deal with any external data or custom business logic. So when we talk about apps, obviously security is a big concern as well, and therefore app permissions are a major important concept as well. So apps for SharePoint have distinct identities. Much like users have user principals, apps have app principals. And naturally, it makes sense that an app would have full control to its own app web. So that is its sandbox, that is its isolated storage. It's going to get full control there. But if you need the app to do anything within the host web, the app where it's being installed, the web where it's being installed, it has to request and be granted those permissions by a site owner who's going to be the one installing the app. And OAuth is what's used behind the scenes to pass app identity. And we could spend easily a full 30 minutes discussing OAuth, but just know that that's the mechanism being used to support the security here. So when we're talking about the tooling in Visual Studio, in terms of how we're going to request and grant these permissions, you're going to see that app permission requests include two components, rights and scopes. So you see here in this slide, if I wanted my app to have the ability to read data at the list level of a host web, I'm going to request the read right at the list scope. And then the way that looks, when a user actually installs this app, they're going to be prompted with this dialog where they're going to basically choose the list to which we want to grant that app the permissions that it's requesting. So I have about 5 minutes left. I just want to quickly walk through a demo using the Office Developer Tools for Visual Studio 2012. So I've opened up Visual Studio 2012. I'm going to create a new project. So when you install the Office Developer Tools for Visual Studio 2012, we get this Office SharePoint Apps category. So I'm going to create a new App for SharePoint 2013 project. We then see this dialog where we're giving the app a name. And for those of you who've worked with Visual Studio 2010's tooling for building apps or for building SharePoint solutions, you're going to have the ability to choose a local site for deployment and local debugging. So this is the address of my local SharePoint environment. And then I'm going to choose which of the 3 app types I'm building. So auto-hosted, again, having the ability to provision resources to Windows and SQL Azure. Provider hosted, where I'm going to deploy any server-side code in some other server that's not my SharePoint front end. Or SharePoint hosted, where it's 100% client-side code and everything is deployed locally. So that's what we're going to do right now. I'm going to select Finish. And quickly, I just want to walk through some of the things that get basically come for free with this App for SharePoint project type. Once this creates, you'll see that there's an app manifest.xml, and that, of course, is the manifest for the app. And there's some tooling built into Visual Studio that gives me a nice graphical front end to that XML file. So here you'll see, over in my Solution Explorer, there are a few modules that are here by default with any App for SharePoint project. Content, images, pages, and scripts. So one thing I didn't point out when I was talking about the different app shapes every app must have at least one immersive full-page component. And the reason for that is that basically when the site owner is looking at the resources that are deployed to that host web, just like any of the list, view all site content with the lists and the libraries on the site, your apps are going to appear there as well. And if a user clicks that, it's going to take the user to some sort of landing page. It's going to take the user to that full-page app component, full-page app of the app. So I'm going to quickly just open up app manifest.xml here, and you'll see there's a permissions tab. So if I wanted my app for SharePoint to have certain permissions at the web level, for instance, I could choose that as a scope, and I could choose full control here. So when the site owner deploys this app, they're going to have the ability to grant that app that permission. Let's go ahead and deploy this app. And in Visual Studio, locally managing this entire deployment experience to my local site. So here's that trust dialog I talked about. So anytime a site owner installs the app, if the app has requested any permissions through the app manifest, which we did here, requesting full control at the web level, the site owner is going to be prompted to trust that app to do that. And then by default, I'm going to be taken to that full page app, that landing page for my app. So one quick thing I wanted to point out here, if you look at the address bar up here, this is apps- and then the unique hash .sp2013apps.com. So in this environment, sp2013apps.com is my app domain, where my host domain is on a completely separate physical domain. Now, if we had more time, I would drill in significantly more in terms of what we can do within the capabilities of an app for SharePoint, building out some things like custom UI extensions, building out app parts. But hopefully this has given you enough of an overview to see a little bit more in terms of the art of the possible with apps for SharePoint 2013. So I'm quickly going to hop back to my slides here. So in conclusion, Microsoft has made significant improvements to the developer experience in SharePoint 2013. What I mean by that is just about anything you could have done in the server-side object model, you can now do through the client object model, the JavaScript object model, and the REST OData endpoints in SharePoint 2013. And apps are, in fact, the recommended approach. But the bottom line is whether you're using apps or not, you should always strive to be running as little code on the SharePoint front-end servers as possible. So thank you for your time. I will turn control back over to Steve here if there's time for any questions or further discussion here at the end.
Great, thanks, Danny. That was awesome. So there's one question out there. We'll wait for some others to come in, but that question is it possible to create a user control, an ACSX, as an app?
So unfortunately, no. Obviously, any ASCX controls are going to require, much like the visual web part controls that prior to some add-ins for Visual Studio 2010 required full trust solutions. The ASCX files themselves would still require file system deployments, and those therefore would not be good candidates for apps. But any capability that you would surface through a user control, you could in fact host externally and reference those through an app part.
Okay, great. I think that was our only question. Oh, wait, there's another one. Sorry. Can the same apps be developed for SharePoint Online 2013, or are they limited compared to what can be done with a local SharePoint server? Which I think goes back to what that comparison slide that you had.
Right. So the beauty of this, the app model with SharePoint is now you're actually looking at, kind of build once, run anywhere. So any kind of SharePoint hosted app that I'm building and testing locally can also be deployed directly to Office 365. Again, we're dealing with 100% client-side code, so there's no DLL, nothing going into the GAC, nothing that's going onto the file system here, and it's very easy to port that solution from an on-prem environment to the cloud.
Okay, there's one other question, Danny. Is there any tool to integrate like PHP? This is what the question is, to integrate other programming languages into the app model.
So the good news is now it's easier than ever to do something like a LAMP application and do just some basic integration with SharePoint using, for instance, the provider-hosted app model. And what you would do in that case is actually through Visual Studio, when you create that new app for SharePoint project, you can say, I'm going to create a provider-hosted app. And then you basically get to provide the URL for where the landing page is for that app and those app resources. So whether those resources are on an IIS platform or on an Apache platform, using Linux, Apache, PHP, etc., you have total control at that point because you're completely outside the SharePoint environment.
Okay, great. And there's a whole bunch of questions coming in now, Danny. So is there integration with the SharePoint object model?
So in terms of the SharePoint object model, anything that you're doing with server-side code is still going to run in a full trust solution. There's really no, other than the similarities in terms of what you can access through the client object model or the JavaScript object model mapping to similar capabilities in the server-side APIs, you're not actually leveraging the server-side APIs.
Okay. Next question is there an app store where it's possible to download apps?
Yes, there is an app store. So your administrators would need to configure access to that and grant permissions for your site owners to have the ability to purchase and install apps from the public app marketplace. But there absolutely is, and it is a pretty seamless experience in terms of being able to search for and pull down apps from the web or apps from a local app catalog, which within your own environment, you have the ability to stand up your own local or corporate app store where your internal corporate apps would be available as well.
Okay, great. In SharePoint 2013, can you still build app pages even if it's not recommended?
You absolutely can. So farm-level solutions and sandbox solutions still fully supported. So obviously, if you're building an application page, you're touching the file system, and that's got to be done through a full trust farm solution.
Okay. And I think this is our last question. What story do you see for Office 365 solutions that need access to timer jobs and such?
So that's still a tough nut to crack, and that's been a problem even going back to the 2010 release of SharePoint Online. Those sorts of capabilities, there really isn't a good way to use a tenant-based hosting model to allow a tenant to have access to that sort of to that level of capability within the environment. So still many of the same challenges there, and as I mentioned earlier, really farm solutions is the only way that you're going to do administrative extensions to the platform.
Okay. The next question is how is it with IntelliSense with JSON and any other client code?
Outstanding. So the Visual Studio 2012 support for JavaScript and even with jQuery. So jQuery comes bundled in with every new app for SharePoint project by default using the Office Developer Tools for SharePoint. Significant enhancements over the 2010 experience. Pretty much seamless IntelliSense with JavaScript as well as obviously still all of the server-side object model stuff as well if you're doing that.
Okay. And this is a follow-up to the gentleman that asked about the integration with the SharePoint object model. So what would be deployed as host deployment? Current 2010 types is the question. I don't know if that makes sense.
So in terms of things that you could build in 2010, in your Visual Studio project, you'd have the ability to do modules and list definitions and content types, and all of those sorts of things are still perfectly valid things to add to app projects for SharePoint 2013. In terms of what's being actually deployed to the server, it's actually just that .app file. So much like you would extract or package up that WSP file in 2010, you can take that .app file, and if your local environment has an app catalog in place, you would upload it there, and that's where it would be made available for anyone to install.
Okay, and a follow-up to that, how do we leverage the IC we already have?
So obviously, you still have full support for anything that you built in 2010, and I think it's going to be a gradual process in terms of migrating those assets. And certainly for new development, it makes sense to have the discussion around, do I build this as an app for SharePoint, or do I continue to leverage some of my full trust solutions? Maybe I have a significant investment in custom libraries and other third-party things. Microsoft generally pledges support for at least one release of backward compatibility, but certainly as you move forward, this would be the model to consider.
Gotcha. And I think this is our last one. How do you debug client object, the client object model?
So again, Visual Studio 2012, outstanding experience, full F5 debugging support, including for JavaScript as well.
Great. And that brings us exactly to the top of the hour. If you have any additional questions, you should be still seeing the screen that has Danny's email address as well as my email address. Danny, I'd like to thank you for your time. This was a great talk. I appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you on future 30 on Thursdays as we move forward. And thanks, everybody, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.